So, good afternoon. Let's kick off. I think most people are in. Some people still coming in. I'm Ashley Brown, MP for South Cambridgeshire. You can see two of me, I've just realised, in my constituency office, and chair of the APPG on the environment. The event today is obviously about peatlands, long overlooked, now more treasured as Britain's rainforest, incredibly biodiverse, very useful for storing carbon dioxide and combating climate change, but heavily damaged. I think 80% of peatlands been damaged, figures I've read. And so it is now high up the political agenda. I know, speaking to colleagues and people very keen to try and restore peatland. The government produced its Peat action plan earlier this year. And the target of restoring 35,000 hectares of peatland by 2025, and the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme and the various other elements of that. I'm delighted to have Tony Juniper, who is, I'm sure you all know, is chair of Natural England in his shed in Cambridge, not that far from me. And he's Natural England is also very involved with the peatland restoration. In fact, literally just learned, manages the £50 million a year, £50 million over 5 years grant scheme, and also then Pat Thompson, who's the lead on peatlands at the RSPB, which has obviously been very heavily involved in policy on peatlands and campaigning on it, and indeed getting hands literally dirty in restoring peatlands. So I'm going to hand it over to Tony in a minute, and then Pat's going to respond, and then, as always, throw it over to you guys to make points and to ask questions. Normal rules apply in terms of please keep yourself on mute unless you're actually speaking. Do either put up your yellow hand and to show that you want to speak or ask a question, or just say in the chat that you want to ask a question. I do have some pre-submitted questions, and also we are tweeting this event. This is a new activity for us, and Twitter is @EnvironmentAPPG if you want to follow it. And with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Tony Juniper. And to us, we've got Daniel Signer as well, another fellow Cambridge MP. So it's a bit Cambridge heavy. This is so the front bench spokesman on environment issues, the Labour Party now. So over to you, Tony. How are we going to? We all agree we need to restore the peatland. How are we actually going to do it, and how are we going to make it? How are we going to make it happen? And are we being ambitious enough?
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, everybody. Maybe just a few words by way of brief introduction to what peatlands are. I guess most people will be familiar with these ecosystems, but just a reminder as to their particular character. So these systems are accumulations of rotting, partially rotting and unrotted plant remains that have built up in some cases over thousands of years. And the particular conditions that cause this to happen is basically waterlogging. And the waterlogging of the land leading to these accumulations of plant material leads to a variety of different ecosystems that are basically underpinned by peat. So one type is fenland, where we're sitting in East Anglia. You find these low-lying areas along the river basins where wet conditions have led to the peat conditions forming, and it's calcareous water coming from the nearby chalk hills in East Anglia, which have led to these particular fen habitats. Go onto the uplands and you find peatlands there dominated by blanket bog, these accumulations of peat like a big duvet stretched over the hillside, creating these rounded hillsides. Sometimes the peat can be 8, even 10 meters deep. And then these other habitats called raised bogs, lowland raised bogs, rain-fed systems that form a dome over time. There's no river water going into them. They're basically fed purely by the rain. And all of these ecosystems have been severely damaged across Britain. And it's interesting to note that across the world, just a few percent of the land surface, about 3%, is dominated by peat soils. In the UK, we have a big bit of that resource, including in relation to the blanket bogs that cover the much of the north of Scotland, all the way down to the moorlands of the south of England on Dartmoor and Exmoor. So this is a globally quite scarce habitat. In the UK, we have a lot of it. And the reason why peatlands are so significant from an environmental point of view, there are several points to this really. One, which we've become very aware of as we're struggling to make the numbers add up on carbon emissions, is the fact that they are an enormous store of carbon. And this is down to the fact that those plant remains are basically down to photosynthesis going on for thousands of years, with plants extracting carbon from the atmosphere and then trapping it in the ground. So unlike other plants that might rot back into the carbon cycle, peat is accumulating carbon over time, and in some cases enormous stores of it. And in fact, in Britain, peat is our biggest terrestrial carbon store. Obviously, we've got carbon held in trees, in salt marshes and in agricultural soils even, but it's in peat that we find the biggest single body of carbon, and millions and millions of tons of it. And keeping that in the ground rather than getting it into the atmosphere, of course, is a big part of how we can approach our ambitions for net zero emissions by 2050. So the carbon piece is huge. And also, so is the water piece. So the peatlands are effectively made two principal ingredients, carbon and water. And the water that's flowing from peatlands is coming out very pure from undamaged peat. The rivers are flowing with no coloration in them. And of course, that brings benefits then for the aquatic environment, for fish, birds and other wildlife that depends upon clean rivers and clean lakes. And as the water is flowing out of peatlands into those water bodies, it's doing so more slowly than when the peat is damaged. And this is then a material factor in flood risk. And quite rightly, over recent years, the connection has been made with flooding not only arising from extreme weather events, which are accompanying the warming of the atmosphere, but also degradation of the land, which is making those rainfall events more damaging. And on top of these functions for water and carbon, peatlands have the most amazing diversity of wildlife living in them. Plants, insects, birds, and indeed the peatlands of the north of England are deemed as internationally important for various bird assemblages, wading birds, golden plover, curlew, redshank, dunlin. These birds that are associated with these beautiful upland landscapes are very much dependent on the health of that ecosystem. And then on top of the health of the wildlife, of course, is the well-being of people. And it's no accident that the national parks, which have been designated for their natural beauty and for the public enjoyment that can come with those designations, much of those upland landscapes are dominated by peatland, blanket bogs, raised bogs, and so on. Now, the trouble with peatland in bringing all of those fantastic benefits, which have huge economic as well as environmental upsides, is the fact that they're being damaged and have been for a very, very long time. So many of our peatlands have been cut to provide peat for fuel. That's something which goes way back into history. They are also subject to agricultural pressures in the post-war years as we tried to open up more land for farming. So peatlands were improved to make them possible to keep livestock, and in some cases to be ploughed to produce arable crops. And indeed, here in East Anglia, we have the fenlands, which now about 0.1% of that peatland is in conservation management, with nearly all of it producing a lot of food. And of course, the food security dimension of that is absolutely immense for the country, with a very high proportion of our vegetables coming from those fenland soils. Other peatlands have been affected by burning, rotational burning, to create certain conditions, including for the rearing of game birds. Complicated and controversial subject in terms of whether that particular management is very damaging or whether it's compatible with the long-term interest, and we may speak about that later on. But all of these pressures between them have led to the point today where about 13% of England's peat is deemed to be in good condition. And so we have a big hill to climb in being able to restore those functions in a way which is going to deliver maximum benefits for society. But fortunately, we have policy aims, Anthony mentioned some of these, to get our peatlands into good shape, including 30,000 hectares into recovery over the next 5 years. And the Nature for Climate Fund that government put into effect a few years ago is now being deployed by a peatland grant recovery scheme, which Natural England is administering, £50 million over 5 years. We just announced the first round of grants to be able to get those projects moving on the ground. And effectively what this entails, really, just to cut a long story short, is to restore the hydrology, to get the water held back in the land, and to, where possible, encourage the peat forming vegetation to start forming on top again. And over time, hopefully what we will achieve, at least in some places, is not only to stop the emissions of carbon coming out of the peat, which are very significant across the country. And indeed, I have one figure in mind from a few years ago. I'm sure there's more up-to-date numbers now, but peatland emissions across the UK were estimated to be equivalent to all of the emissions of Edinburgh, Cardiff and Leeds combined. So all the homes and transport in those cities is about equivalent to what was coming out of our peatlands. So this is a very material piece of work that we can do to help get towards the net zero ambition by mid-century. And so getting that hydrology restored and trying to get that peat forming vegetation hopefully will not only stop the emissions, but over time begin to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it away in the ground. Now, the big challenge in all of this, recognizing that about 80% of the emissions coming from peatland are coming from lowland peat. So those agricultural soils, not only in Cambridgeshire, in the northwest of England, in the southwest and the Somerset levels, that of course is a bigger hill, because those landscapes are in very important industries, namely producing food, with of course a big economic momentum behind that. And so how we shift that land use from producing food into a position where we can start to reduce emissions and hopefully start to get the peat working again, as it historically did, is quite a big and complicated deal. Part of the peat initiative in England at the moment involves the establishment of a lowland agricultural peat task force. Natural England is a part of that, and what we're hoping to do there is to find ways, working with landowners, to be able to develop management methods which are going to enable us to keep much of that carbon as we possibly can in the ground. Actually, sitting here in Cambridgeshire, I was struck a couple of years ago seeing some estimates suggesting that alongside all of the cars and homes and industries that work in this part of the country, about 50% of the emissions are coming from the peat, which is a huge big deal if you start to look at it from the point of view of our carbon targets. So much to be done. Happily, some pioneering work going on here, including in the Great Fen in North Cambridgeshire up towards Huntingdon, trialling different methods of so-called paludiculture. Paludiculture being ways in which you can combine cropping with wetlands. So can we re-wet the peat to stop the emissions and hopefully get some peat forming again at the same time as producing useful crops out of that, which will bring an economic return? And I saw some work going on up the road there at the Great Fen, looking at some food crops, some kind of grains that grow in wet conditions, but also crops that would enable us to produce insulation materials, perhaps giving us a double benefit on the net zero agenda. So some big challenges, much to be done, much to be gained, and also now some policies coming through that can help us go on this journey together. And I have to say, you know, the peatland issue over the decades that I've been involved with conservation, it's gone from being very marginal to now coming centre stage. So hopefully we're at a tipping point where we can actually now start to get scale behind some of the things that we know that work. And alongside what we're doing at Natural England, it's really encouraging and heartening to see some really fantastic initiatives in train at the moment, including the Moors for the Future work going on in the Peat District, where not only has there been heavy pressure from cutting and draining of peat up there, but also historic industrial pollution coming from the industrial cities of the northwest, which killed off the peat growing surface a couple of centuries ago. And so that actually is revealing how we can bring peatlands back even from that very degraded state, turning black hills back to green and purple again. That work's delivering results. On the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, working across the North Yorkshire moors and across the Yorkshire Dales, big benefits being derived there through partnership working with people managing and owning land, and also water companies, amongst others, being led by the conservation community. One thing that I've been really inspired by is hearing of plans for a so-called Great North Bog, which will attempt to get restoration of peatlands running from Sheffield right up to the Scottish border, and a whole range of partners involved with that. So much to be done, much being done, and hopefully over the coming years we'll start to see some real momentum getting behind what's happening.
Great, well, thank you for that fantastic overview and that sense of optimism that we're going to conquer this. I'm going to come now to Pat Thompson, as I said at the beginning, is the expert on peat at the RSPB, often getting their hands dirty. And I should say that Daniel Zyko, who's the Labour spokesman on environment, is going to say a few words after that as well. So, Pat, over to you. Is it? I suppose the question is enough being done? What else needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my immediate response to that would be we need to do more, and we need to do it more urgently. But let me start by saying, Tony, that was absolutely great. You've left me damn near nothing to say. I wholeheartedly agree with the majority of the content of your presentation. It was always going to be like this, okay? So before I say any more, I would like to acknowledge recent work undertaken by the IUCN UK Peatland programme, the statutory nature conservation agencies, and the peatland restoration partnerships that you were just talking about, Tony, who have done so much to survey the extent and condition of our peatlands and to consider the drivers of change, and even to start getting the restoration works going at scale. As Tony notes, kind of our peatlands are of incredible importance, both in the uplands and the lowlands, and often our lowland peatlands are forgotten. And again, as Tony noted, despite their importance, actually, they're not in great heart. So we need to do a lot more to determine the extent and the condition of our peatlands, and we very much welcome the mapping work that DEFRA and Natural England are doing to map the extent, the depth and the condition of our peat and peatlands across England. Now, this will help us much better target the restoration efforts. So it's going to be a really important tool, but it's not going to be ready until 2024. Not a problem. Most of the damaged areas are actually well known to us. Tony touched on a few of them, places like the kind of Peat district, for example. So there's much work we can do now to commence restoration, both in the uplands and in the lowlands. And the policies are now coming into place, and the finance is now coming into place. So Tony referred to the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme to tackle restoration across the England peatlands. In Scotland, they've got the Peatland Action Fund. So that's fantastic. And some of these policy and funding mechanisms are being supported by a range of external funders as well, which the major landscape scale peatland restoration projects are tapping into. So that's exciting, and there's lots of kind of innovative work going on to unleash new finance as well that can be invested in our peatlands. So what do we need to do now, and what do we need to do urgently? Well, I guess the key thing we have to do is to stop the main damaging practices. So it's all well and good to restore them, but we've got to stop the things that are causing the problems in the first place. So we've got to really have to stop things like peat extraction, burning, drainage, and afforestation on peatland. We agree with the England Peat Action Plan, which says that all use of peatland should keep peat wet and in the ground. That's a very simple statement, but if you think about it, it's a really beautiful way of putting what we need to do. And then we need to think about restoring our peatlands as an investment for the future. Now, kind of Tony touched on this, but I mean, in essence, restoration will help secure the vast store of carbon that's been locked up in peat over thousands of years, and also recover the peat-forming vegetation. And that peat-forming vegetation is essential to the ongoing locking up of the carbon, so effectively sequestering new carbon to sit alongside the store that's built up over thousands of years. And that healthy peatland vegetation also helps, it plays a key role in regulating water quality and flows, and of course is home to a diversity of amazing wildlife, some of which is undergoing kind of major declines. the act of restoring and rewetting our peatlands is of fundamental importance to making our peatlands more resilient to drought and associated risks of wildfire. And both of those things are becoming increasingly more common as a consequence of climate change. And again, as Tony mentioned, in the context of lowland peat, we do now urgently need to think about ways in which we farm those lowland peat landscapes in a way that actually helps keep the remaining peat and carbon locked up. So we're going to have to completely change the way we actually farm those landscapes. And Tony touched upon things like polludiculture. So time is of the essence, both for you and me. I've got two questions really, sub-questions for Tony and one for members. So Tony, how are we getting on with the target of restoring 35,000 hectares of peatland by 2025? So that's for you. And then members, all too often, our amazing peatlands are characterised as being cold, wet and miserable and of little worth. Now, they are often cold, wet and can be miserable. And I'm reminded of Bill Bryson, who describes his journey through the fabulous flow country of Caithness and Sutherland, the far north of Scotland, on his train, where he talks about we rode for a seeming eternity through a great Scottish void full of miles of nothingness. And the wonderful irony is he wrote that as he travelled through our flagship nature reserve in Forcenard in Sutherland. But the harsh reality is that is how some people see our peatlands, and we want to invest in them and to restore them for public benefit. So the public have a key role to play in helping protect our members, protect our peatlands. What more do we need to do to heighten public awareness of the importance of peatlands and build the support for funding and policies we need to protect our peatlands? And that's me, thank you.
Okay, Pat, that's great. And you posed two great questions there, which we'll come to, but I just want to bring in Daniel Zeichler first, because I know he can't stay for the whole time. As I said, the Labour front-running spokesman on environment. I suppose the question really, Daniel, is are there other things you'd like to see be done, or what are your main concerns?
Well, thank you, Anthony. Very generous of you to bring me in. Very Cambridge focused we are at the moment.
By accident.
Great to see you, Tony.
Likewise,
as ever, and love the enthusiasm and the optimism. I spent my summer on a tour of English farms and national parks, and when you said that some of these issues are controversial and difficult, boy, you're right when you meet people on the ground. So I don't envy you your task sometime. Three questions really. One, echoing what has already been asked. From Natural England's point of view, what would make the biggest difference to help on this in the short to medium term? Secondly, a much broader question. You talked about the different land uses, particularly in the fens, the issues around whether we are a food-producing nation. I very much think we are a food-producing nation, but we don't have a national land use plan. I think Scotland's looking at it. Is it time for that, and would it help? And then just finally, some of this always is about resourcing. You'll know that I have been involved in a debate, perhaps with the Minister, on the environmental land management system. Partly I went round to look at how it's going. It's a great scheme, but frankly, it isn't easy. You and I have discussed this before. What would we need to do to make ELM work to tackle this particular problem? Easy questions.
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you, Daniel, and thanks, Pat. Should I have a go at those, Anthony? Just to get the ball rolling. So first of all, on Pat's point about the, will we do 30,000 hectares by 2025? Well, that is certainly the aim, and at Natural England, we're doing everything we can to meet that target. And from what I've heard from colleagues, the grant scheme will certainly get us on that trajectory, but we won't have restored peatlands in 5 years. Hopefully what we will have done is begun the restoration process and to start turning the corner on some of these places and, keep it wet, keep it in the ground. I mean, that sums it up very well, doesn't it? And so that's basically where we're heading. But that 30,000 hectares, important to note, that's about the first 10%. And the other 90% will have to follow after that. So this is a long road that we're on, but at least we've now going down the right road rather than continuing down the old road, which did involve, the degradation of these systems, including putting them into bags to be sold in garden centres, which there's another policy commitment there to phase that out soon. And so hopefully that will be something that we'll see some progress on during the coming period. Now, Daniel's question, what's going to make the difference? And I'm thinking of that other 90% in particular. I think what we have to do is find some ways of really driving investment into the recovery of these places, not only from government sources, but also from private sector sources. And so you can think of a few things, actually, including government sources, that we could upscale. So three headings I'll give you very quickly. So one, can we find ways of encouraging water companies to spend less money on reservoirs and pipes and cleaning plants, water purification plants, and instead investing some of that money in peatland recovery as a means of doing that same work? And actually, United Utilities, Yorkshire Water, South West Water are among companies that are already doing that. And so one wonders whether we might do something through Ofwat to encourage more of that money that the water companies spend looking after our water supply through what are effectively nature-based solutions. And South West Water, I know, have found that this is a cost-effective way. It's cheaper to invest in peatland recovery than it is expensive new kit that uses chemicals and a lot of electricity to clean up the water. So there's opportunities there to get some join up. Another opportunity for join up would be to find a way, and this is slightly controversial, well, no, quite controversial, is to find ways in which we might drive carbon finance into this. Is there a way of blending in some of the money that companies are going to spend on going to net zero into this space? And so I did a bit of work with Heathrow Airport, actually, before I came to Natural England, whereby, they were looking to how can we do net zero? And, the aeroplanes is a whole different story. Those are different companies. But in terms of what Heathrow can do for its ground operations, they can go to renewables. They can go for super energy efficiency. They can go for energy use avoidance, but there will be a residual. And so I said to them, why don't you invest some money in recovering British peatlands? And so they put some money into some experiments, which hopefully over time can start to get some scale and show how we can join up the ambition of companies here to go to net zero and to have residual emissions as part of an overall plan that could be invested in nature, and peatlands could be a part of that. And then another opportunity we've got is, big flood budgets that government's investing in. We can spend some of that on concrete and flood defences of a more familiar kind. But actually investing in the uplands where the floods are originating would be, I think, something that we could explore more to see if we could be making the most of that resource. Because not only would you get flood risk reduction, you'd also get a carbon benefit, also get a biodiversity benefit, also get a river water quality benefit too. And so I think there's more that can be done there to make a difference. And then finally, Daniel, your point on the land use plan, I'm not speaking for Natural England when I say this necessarily, although I have engaged in a few conversations with colleagues there about this, because it does strike me that in a country like England, with 55 million people living on, a quite small area of land and sea, we don't really have a plan to make the most rational use of our little bit of the world. We need housing. We need food production, we need infrastructure, we need industry, we need water supply, we need energy, we need resources like timber, and we need to, catch carbon and have places for people to enjoy themselves, beautiful places. And, all of these things, they tend to finish up as a series of binary choices. Should we have greenbelt or should we have housing? Should we have wilder landscapes or should we have food production? Should we have wind turbines or a beautiful uninterrupted view? And as a result of all these things kind of being debated as binary choices, we very rarely get the whole picture. And, that whole picture, I think, is something that increasingly we're going to have to try and get at least some sense of. I mean, nobody wants some overbearing government centralized bureaucracy telling everyone, what the land use is where they live, but trying to find some way of bringing in a process where we can have a more rational set of conclusions, I think is absolutely vital. And I don't know what's going on in Scotland, but I think, you know, that is something that strikes me as a logical step, given all of these competing demands.
I agree. I think that's a really interesting idea about the land use plan.
Yes.
Actually, I had this debate recently with people in Cambridge, actually, because I'm trying to encourage more tree planting in Cambridgeshire. And some people came to me and said, should we have a forest of Cambridgeshire? And then other people said, well, actually, it's about the most productive agricultural land in the entire country. If you could choose anywhere to plant a forest, it wouldn't be on the most productive agricultural land, it would be elsewhere.
Exactly.
Pat, I don't know if you wanted to come in on any of those points about either offsetting or land use planning.
No, I'll leave that be. I think Tony said plenty on that. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm coming to some of the questions. So Matt Brown from the Wildlife and Countryside Link. Matt, I can see you there, but coming into vision, yeah. Do you want to ask your question? I know you put it in the link, but it's always nice to hear people's voices.
Yes, hello all. Thanks for a very interesting discussion. It's just a question about the rotational burning on upland peat. So over the past year, we've seen quite a lot of progress in the sense that, you know, DEFRA have recognised that the scientific consensus that it's damaging to upland peat and upland peat formation. And I think that's a fair assessment. We've seen some sort of further progress on that, where you had heather burning regulations passed by SI earlier this year. But clearly more action needs to be taken. And it'd be really interesting just to hear the panel's thoughts on the right balance of stick and carrot, as it were. Is it a case of extending those regulations further to cover more upland peat? At the moment, Link, we've estimated it probably under 50% is covered. Or is it more a focus on making a positive case for different forms of upland peat management to the landowners and really making the positive case for re-wetting? It'd be good to hear those thoughts. Thank you very much.
So shall I come to Pat first and then Tony, just to reverse the order slightly? So Pat, what do you think about banning, I guess, burnings of vegetation? I assume you're in favour.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, we've long argued that we want to see the cessation of burning on peatland vegetation and deep peat soils. Yeah, like I say, we've argued for a long time for that to happen. We very much welcome the steps that DEFRA have taken through the introduction of the new heather and grass burning regs, but we don't think that goes far enough and we don't think it goes fast enough. But we recognise that progress takes time. And yes, as Matt alluded to, we believe there is an emerging consensus on the associated negative impacts of burning on peat. But my goodness, there's an almighty row going on within the academic community about how strong the effect is or isn't. But our view is it should stop, and primarily our view is that it needs to stop is because it's getting in the way of restoring the peatland resource as a whole. And in many parts of English uplands, what we've got is peatland restoration happening, and some of those areas then still being included within burn rotations, which means that these areas of peatland are just locked into a cycle of burn recovery, and we just think that needs to stop, really, particularly as there's other ways of managing that surface vegetation, particularly through cutting, for example.
Thank you. Tony, I don't know, either speaking personally or as the Chair of Natural England?
Well, as the Chair of Natural England, I can say that we published a position a few years ago, reaching similar conclusions to what Pat just described, in the sense that rotational burning, it does diminish the health of blanket bog. And so we suggested to government that in order to promote the biodiversity outcomes that the designated peatlands are seeking to achieve, that it would be good to end rotational burning. And so that has now turned into a policy which applies to European designated sites, or internationally designated sites, we could say today. And those regulations hopefully will have a positive effect on the management of that land. But that policy, of course, is coming from a biodiversity perspective, which is absolutely right, but doesn't come from a carbon perspective. And so those peatlands outside the protected areas, which are still being burnt, they may not in the long term have the same carbon benefits that they might do compared to if they were in better health. And so it would be good to extend the management of peatlands into that place where they're going to recover and be in a better state. Whether that then comes down to some regulation is a different matter. We have the new ELM policy, the environmental land management policy coming forward, plus you have the peatland grant scheme that we're operating through the Nature for Climate Fund, and one would hope that these kinds of incentives could be used to achieve where the science is pointing us at, without having to resort, to direction and regulation, and that would be our preference. So that's work in progress, and we will learn a lot during the course of the Peatland grant scheme being rolled out. And as I said, many initiatives already underway, bringing landowners and land managers in, hopefully as partners rather than the recipient of direction, to be able to do this. And I do think probably there is more that could be done through different kinds of partnerships to look at alternative management to enable people to get the outcomes they want through different methods. Cutting is the one that's being most talked about. So hopefully we can go on a journey together as people speak more. And the upland discussion in particular, it's become very polarized between different groups, and I think that is a bit of a blockage to making progress. But as I say, new tools, new policies coming forward that hopefully will enable people to be working more together on this.
Great. Before I come to Lucinda Lay, who's asked a question, I just wanted we had a pre-submitted question about burning, which is relevant. It's from Henrietta Appleton at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, but she asks, in the event of a ban on managed cool burns, there will be vast increase in surface vegetation. What is the proposed strategy for the funding and control of this growth to prevent the predicted increase in wildfire? Would you need more to manage the growth of vegetation if you did have a ban on burning? So, Tony or Pat?
Yeah, so I would argue that the so-called fuel load, the amount of heather that's sitting on top of these peatlands at the moment, is much greater than it should be naturally. So if those peatlands were in a healthy, functioning state, they wouldn't support anything like the amount of surface heath vegetation that they currently do. Indeed, some of our bog habitats more resemble heath than bog. So our argument is you need to re-wet them, get that water table back up, and that then checks the surface vegetation. So you just don't get this profuse surface layer of shrubby material. I accept that's going to take time, but we need to work together towards peatlands being in a more favourable state. And in a more favourable state, they won't support that fuel load.
Yeah, I agree with that, Anthony. The burning side is one bit of it, but the re-wetting is the other. And if we can do both together, we're going to get to a better place than just doing one or the other.
Great. So coming to Lucinda then, who asked a question. Lucinda, if you could just say where you're from as well before you ask a question.
Hi there. So I'm from Mighty Landscapes, and I'm coming at this from a very novice ecologist perspective. So having sort of joined Mighty in January, in April, I started to look at the sustainability of what they were doing, and we've set a target to remove peat from our supply chain by the end of the year. But one of the things that I was surprised by was that it wasn't already illegal. And Googling it, I can see that, it's going to be 2024 that it will become illegal. But surely that's too late in the grand scheme of things. And so I'm interested in the story there, the background and what's going on there. And then my second question, and then I'll shut up. Our clients are looking at this from two perspectives. The first one being, so we manage 9,000 sites across the UK. So what we're doing with biodiversity just has a really big impact. They're looking at it from biodiversity because they want to do the right thing, but equally there's a difference in restoring land for biodiversity and restoring it for carbon sequestration. And they're increasingly finding that there is a heavier push towards carbon offsetting and exploring how to use their land for offsetting. So I guess the question, we're in conversations with National Parks Partnership, for example, and I guess the question is, should we be looking at peatland projects for offsetting, or should we be looking at reforestation, which is better?
Yeah.
And
good questions. Should I have a go, Anthony?
Yeah, Tony, you come first. So why haven't we banned? And I know it's coming in, but but also you mentioned offsetting in your answer. If you are choosing an offsetting, is it better to do peat or trees?
Yes. Well, all I can say about the ban on horticultural peat is better late than never. So I was involved in campaigns on this in the early 1990s when I worked with Friends of the Earth, and actually working in partnership with friends at the RSPB and WWF and elsewhere. We were campaigning to phase out horticultural peat from garden centres and everything else. And, you know, various round tables and initiatives were established. Retailers said they were going to do something to put alternatives on the shelves, and it didn't really happen. And that's 30 years worth of you know, discussion that's gone on there. Happily, we are finally getting to a place where this is going to be resolved. In the meantime, actually, we did have some victories here. Quite a lot of the peatlands which are now in conservation management for recovery, like Thorn and Hatfield Moors in Yorkshire, Bolton Fell Moss in Cumbria, some of the moors in Somerset. You know, as a result of the campaigns that we all did back then, these places now are national nature reserves being managed for recovery. But at the same time, what happened is that we started importing peat from Estonia and Ireland, which is where much of it's coming from now. There's still a little bit being dug in Somerset, but most of it's coming from abroad. But of course, you know, that's causing damage there, and the carbon doesn't care where it's coming from. It's still finishing up in the atmosphere. So the ban is still very much the right thing to do. A big blockage, apart from the peat companies who were making a living and businesses out of that, which, you know, they were doing, there's been, you know, a big debate about the alternatives and what we can use instead. And there was a period where we had quite a supply of coir coming into the country. So this is a byproduct of the coconut industry. But in different parts of the tropics, the coconut industry has collapsed, actually, which means that there's been less of a supply of that. But, you know, from what I've heard from people who are expert in composts for horticulture, you know, we do have alternatives and people can do that. We just need to invest in the supply chain, invest in the quality, and then start building up demand, and we can do that. So I don't think it's not insurmountable by any means. It just requires some commitment to do it. And I think the ban will really push that along. On whether we should be doing offsetting or biodiversity, you know, the simple thing is we must do both and in the same place. And if you do biodiversity and carbon objectives in the same peatland landscape, in most places you will get a water benefit as well, and very often a tourism benefit and a public access benefit. So these two things are not alternatives. And actually, this is where there has been a tension over the years, is the extent to which quite a lot of our forestry plantations down the decades have been targeted at peatlands. And, you know, at Natural England, we've had some very productive and constructive discussions with Forestry Commission lately, and we've reached a consensus at least about the need to avoid planting trees on deep peat. Because if you're going to dry the peat out by planting trees on it, you know, it's almost worse than nothing in terms of a carbon offset, because there's going to be far more carbon lost out of the peat than you're going to catch in the trees. And so, you know, that's something which I think is pretty clear. Where there are still some continuing discussions is whether we should be removing trees that have already been planted on peat and get them off. And also, you know, what we should be doing about shallow peat. And at Natural England, you know, we see, you know, the biodiversity and carbon priorities as suggesting that actually, in many cases, getting the trees off of the peat in the north of England, in Northumberland, for example, there's cases of where this, we believe, would be sensible, and also some places where we're actively doing that. So I was over on some raised bogs on the Welsh border last week at one of our national nature reserves, where we're in the process of removing a very large number of conifers planted there in the 1960s and 1970s. And so they're coming off. And hopefully, you know, that will lead to the peat recovering and being a far better carbon store than those trees ever would be. So I would say, Lucinda, that it's not a choice. You know, when it comes to peatlands, you know, the carbon and biodiversity benefits go hand in hand. And if you do it right, you can get both.
Pat.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Lucinda, whatever you do, please don't put trees on peat. I completely endorse what Tony's just said. And then in terms of getting trees off bogs and restoring those bogs, yes, there is significant expertise on this now. We've been doing huge amounts of this in the far north of Scotland. And the great news is it's working. Yeah. So it can happen. It can be done.
Great, thank you. Dustin Benton, hello Dustin, you had a related question actually, but I think a more sort of finely tuned one. If you want to say where you're from as well, please.
Sure. Thank you. I think Tony may have answered my question, so I've got a slightly different one, if that's all right. And I'm asking from the perspective of the National Food Strategy. My question is, what's the right balance between regulation and incentives, and how does that change across lowland peat and upland peat? I'll just give a little bit of background. When we were doing the analysis for the food strategy, we found that the bottom 20% of least productive agricultural land produces about 3% of food. That's mostly in the uplands. And so, you're not at great risk there. The converse, however, the most productive 20% produces close to a third of our food, and that's quite concentrated in lowland peats. However, this land has far and away the highest carbon emissions of any land in the country, which is currently not priced. So I'll just leave that there as a taster for the question.
Yes, no, very good question, Dustin, and congratulations on that food strategy. And of the many statistics and insights that came out of it, that is one I'm often repeating, is how 20% of our land could be primarily delivering ecosystem and nature benefits, and indeed carbon benefits, at the sacrifice of 3% of the food. And if we reduced our food waste, of course, we quickly get that 3%. So, that was a fantastic analysis you did in joining all these pieces together and making that connection between the land and the nature and the carbon and the food. And yes, and so then the question becomes, as you quite rightly say, the balance between incentives and regulation. And so in terms of the regulatory tools, one of them we've mentioned already, the burning piece. Another one is sites of special scientific interest, and these kinds of land-based designations. They are vital and important, but won't help you with, an agricultural field in Cambridgeshire, which would never be a site of special scientific interest and isn't burnt. And, what would you do about that? And I think this is where we then need to be thinking about the incentives that are coming with the new agricultural policy. The idea of shifting from subsidies to payments for environmental services, and keeping that carbon in the ground is a massive environmental service. And so how can we line up those incentives to do that? It's challenging, however, because the economic value of the food that's coming out is huge. And so replacing that with a carbon value, you're talking quite big numbers. So we've got to think this through and work out how we can align these two competing priorities, which, as you point out, is a priority on the carbon side, because that's where most of it's coming from when it's related to peatlands. And all I can say at the moment is that the Lowland Agricultural Peatland Task Force is the place where that conversation is going on, and we're there alongside others in trying to square that off. But what we will need to do, obviously, is work with the people who are managing those landscapes, think about the food dimension, look at the carbon piece, and then look at the new emerging policy and think through, what the solution could be. But it's not simple, is, I think, apparent to all concerned, but it is a priority.
Pat, do you have any?
Yeah, just as an add-on, Dustin. So, just reflecting on your kind of point there about the least productive land in the context of agricultural production. Often those parcels of land are actually the most productive in terms of the context of the sorts of ecosystem services that Tony's been talking about, and nature itself. So often those areas of land may be managed by farming systems that are intrinsically more high nature value, for example. They don't produce much in terms of food, but they could be incredibly important farming systems in important landscapes for nature. These are the places I go to see nature, for example, and many of these farming systems still support an abundance of nature that has long gone from many other parts of the country. So yeah, maybe not very productive in terms of food, but hugely productive in terms of nature. And we just need to make sure that one doesn't dominate the other.
Thank you. So one question for me, we also do a lot of events on the Committee on Climate Change and reaching the net zero target. And peatland is occasionally mentioned, but not more in passing than anything else. And also there's big issues like banning petrol and diesel cars and so on. Really, my question is whether you think peatland has enough attention in terms of the whole getting to net zero by 2050 strategy, or whether more focus should be on it given its potential to absorb carbon dioxide.
Well, should I start, Anthony? I mean, it is coming. It kind of goes back to remarks that we've made during the course of the conversation this afternoon about the rising profile of peatlands. You know, for many people, you know, it looks like a wasteland. What can we do to develop it up to get some value out of it? And, you know, over the decades, we've made some choices which now, you know, from the carbon point of view, that they're far from optimal, we can see. So, you know, that is shifting, and it's going to take a while to go the full journey. Like so many of these environmental questions, you know, there's definitely a cultural piece, as Pat was saying a moment ago. You know, how can we get the public more behind all of this and on this agenda, and, you know, to start changing some of the mindsets that frame how we've looked at these things in the past, and, you know, trying to find some way of making the value real in an economic sense for people who are managing these places has got to be, you know, a big part of the answer, because people are, you know, they make their livelihoods on these peatlands. And so, you know, thinking that somehow it's going to be a carbon sink rather than a source of livelihood, that's really not going to happen without going with the flow of the people who are managing these places. And so that's what we have to, you know, square off is these, well, perceptions, competing interests alongside the emerging science, and putting policy between all of that. But it's happening.
Pat, I think.
Yeah, and I just add that, you know, healthy peatlands basically have the potential to take up a small amount of carbon on a per annum basis. So they in themselves are not going to be the solution to our problems. And indeed, peatlands that are degraded can leak carbon. But if that degradation escalates, you can potentially threaten the entire peat carbon store and get massive loss of that. So there's been some modelling studies done in Scotland, for example, looking at predicted climate change and the potential impact that that's going to have on peat condition and the potential for losing thousands of years of carbon in a relatively short period of time. So not much in, not much out, but if you get it wrong, you could lose the whole lot, basically. And we just don't want to be there. We want those peatlands landscapes to be in good nick.
Excellent. I think you mentioned, Pat, I think it's you who mentioned earlier on the mapping, the spatial mapping of peatlands, which has now come out. I'm just wondering, is that how important is that, and could it be done sort of other ways it could be improved in terms of, I presume, resource allocation and working out which bits restore or not restore? Is it completely instrumental, or do we need to focus more on improving the data we have there? Pat, do you know?
Yeah, well, so I know a little bit about the peatland map because I've been involved with working alongside DEFRA and Natural England who are developing it. So we don't at the moment have a really good understanding, sounds strange, but we don't have a really good understanding of the extent of peat, particularly the depth of peat and the condition of the peat, both in terms of the peat itself and the vegetation on top. So that all of those elements are really critical to helping us better understand where we need to invest. So this mapping is actually happening using a variety of different satellite imagery and on-the-ground checking with depth modelling and that kind of stuff. And we'll soon have a really good map, and that will much better enable us to target the restoration effort. Without it, we're a little bit blind. And so we've got things like, you know, the new heather and grass burning regulations, which tell us that there shouldn't be any burning on peat over 40 centimetres deep. Well, where is that? What's the landowner meant to do? Go out with a stick and measure it? If we had a map, we'd be able to just map all those areas and say, within these broad geographical areas, no burning, for example. So we need that map, and it's coming, and it's very welcome.
Tony, any thoughts on the mapping, bogs?
Nothing much to add, Anthony, except to note that DEFRA is looking at how best to invest in a natural capital ecosystem assessment process going forward that will be taking this data hopefully to a new level over the coming years, not just peatlands, but everything.
Yeah. So I have another question about the different interaction of different government strategies, and you've both said you should plant trees on peatlands, and there's obviously the government's tree strategy to plant 30,000 hectares of trees a year, but there's also the species abundance target as well. I'm just wondering how this all fits together. Are they sort of parallel? I mean, it sounds like the tree strategy is completely separate from the peatland strategy. Yeah. But species abundance target, how's that fit in?
Yeah, so these big targets, they are fantastic. It's really great to see that we've got these overarching goals now, which give us a real sense of direction. And you think of the power of the Climate Change Act and the target setting there, and how how that's helped to galvanise the action that we're now seeing. Much more is needed, but we're on the path now. Similarly, with the biodiversity and the 30% protected by 2030 in terms of land and sea, this is a new kind of compass bearing we've got. And what it will require, I think, and at Natural England we think, is to be integrating lots of different policies that we've got at the moment and to get them pointing more in the same direction. And so there's a lot of pieces coming together. So the ELM, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, a vital and key part of all of this. We've got the peatland policy, which we've talked a lot about today. We've also got the tree strategy coming through. We have the tool of biodiversity net gain coming from the Environment Bill. And we've got a new spatial planning tool in the form of the local nature recovery strategies. We have big ambitions on flood risk reduction, which can be aligned with all of this. And we've got a new planning bill coming soon, which will be critical, I think, in closing at least some of the points we talked about earlier about overall land use planning. And so if we can put all of this together, that stuff is achievable. Those big goals are achievable. But if we have it as a semi-detached environmental policy that isn't integrated with everything else, then we're going to struggle. But the opportunity is there now because the policy is ambitious and it's good, but it's going to require integration. I know good discussions going on in DEFRA at the moment about how we can get the DEFRA bodies, so EA, for example, ourselves and Forestry Commission, pointing in the same direction, using our resources, statutory power and expertise to meet these big goals. And that goes right across government, infrastructure, housing, and actually water is another big one in terms of getting, the future investments we need in the security of water for the country and wastewater treatment, also pointing in that direction too. So the opportunity is there, Anthony. It's incredibly exciting to see this, having been involved with all of these subjects for so many years, to see the opportunity there now presented with those targets and those policies coming, but they've got to be joined together in a strategic way to make the difference.
Yeah. Pat, I assume you agree with that being joined.
Well, yeah, I guess last word almost. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Integrated land use, integrated government policy. And of course it has to happen. And you can expect the NGO community to be looking closely to check that it is happening.
Excellent. We'll keep you to your word there. I'll make sure it's happening as well. We do have one last question. We've just got one more minute. I'll ask it out. It's from Amanda Anderson. Just about on the mapping, going back to the mapping point, saying that will the map measure also measure the water table depth? If keeping peat wet is key, then so is the water table depth. And I don't know the answer to that, but it's obviously a valid point.
Yeah, my working assumption would be that it won't measure the water table depth, but that the vegetation on the top of the vegetation community that's monitored will be a proxy for water table depth.
Right. Tony, I don't know if you've got any views on that.
Well, that sounds sensible to me, what Pat just said.
Yeah, on that, it's 1:06. We've got to finish. Thank you very much for a really fascinating session on peatlands. I know it's a big issue of political concern, as you say, but things are moving in the right direction. We've got to make sure that it does properly move in that direction. Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.
And probably go a bit faster. Anyway, thank you, Tony Juniper, and thank you, Pat Thompson.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Pat. Nice to see you.
Yeah, bye, everyone. Been a pleasure, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.